Um, so today we're looking at, within the context of envisioning a climate-safe California, we're going to be talking about what lackluster progress at COP28 means for our state. And we have some really great guests who will be here to talk about their experiences at COP28 and what it means to them and what it means to our state. Our webinar sponsors, for which we're very grateful, help us to put these on for free for everyone. Silicon Valley Clean Energy, SunPower, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, Sonoma Clean Power, MCE, Empowering Our Clean Energy Future, River City Bank, Sunrun, Calpine Energy Solutions, RNA, and Peninsula Clean Energy. Want to thank all of our webinar sponsors for being willing to help us in putting on these webinars monthly. We also have promotional partners. These are folks who help to get the word out about the webinar. Joint Venture Silicon Valley, Civic Well, Climate Resolve, Grid Alternatives, Clean Coalition, Community Environmental Council, and Actera. Again, thanks to all of our partners. So these are upcoming Climate Center events that we thought you might want to be aware of. Our February webinar will be on community energy resilience, opportunities for federal and state funding. The date has not yet been set, but I'm sure that we will get the word out to you several times once we set the date so that you can register and attend if you're interested. And secondly, we're having our in-person California Climate Policy Summit in Sacramento on Tuesday, March 19th. We've already lined up some wonderful speakers, including Assembly Member Robert Rivas, who's also the Speaker of the Assembly, the California Air Resources Board Chair, Leon Randolph, former California Water Board Chair, Felicia Marcus, and many, many more. We'll have a plenary in the morning and breakout sessions in the afternoon. Early bird registration is open, and you'll see on the bottom, we wanted to thank the sponsors who have already stepped in to support us in putting on our Climate Policy Summit. So today's agenda, we're at the first bullet point, which is me. Then we'll be hearing from Barry Vesser, who will introduce Colin Rees, the U.S. Program Manager for Oil Change International. Then Barry will introduce Senator Monique Limon from the California State Senate. We'll have a Q&A session, which will be facilitated by Barry. Then we'll hear from Senator Henry Stern, one of our climate champions, also from the California State Senate. Barry will then facilitate a Q&A, and then I'll be back to talk about taking action. But before we get started, we wanted to share a little bit about the Climate Center and our Climate Safe California campaign. This is our vision. We believe in thriving, healthy communities, and what we're trying to do is to make sure that everyone in California benefits from equitable access to climate solutions, clean air, renewable energy, healthy food, green spaces, safe streets, and all that entails. If you're wondering what the photo is, it is Dolores Park in San Francisco, which I remember from my time living there. Climate Safe's California is our unique and comprehensive campaign to make California the first state in the nation to become carbon negative. And as we know, as goes California, goes the world. And so it's very important that we take the lead in that effort. Whoops, sorry. These are our 3 guiding principles for our Climate Safe California campaign. It has to be based on the latest science. We have to ensure a just transition for fossil fuel workers and the communities they live in, and prioritize climate justice and equal access to climate solutions. So all of our work is based upon these 3 principles. The Climate Safe California campaign has been endorsed by hundreds of businesses, elected officials, nonprofits, and more than 2,000 individuals. I actually think we're up to 2,200 overall at this point. But it's really a cross-section of Californians and the different people who live and work in the state and want the state to be climate safe from the risks of climate change. So for 2024, we're still refining our policy priorities, but they are based around three main pillars. We want to rapidly cut greenhouse gas emissions, which I think all of us agree needs to happen urgently. We want to build a grid for the future that's clean, reliable, affordable, decentralized, and safe, so that we don't have to worry about our grid going down in times of stress. And finally, scaling up natural carbon sequestration. And I really wish we could think of a different word besides sequestration. But the focus is on the natural carbon sequestration, whether it's natural lands, the ocean, different places where we can use science-based targets for drawing down climate pollution using nature-based strategies. And with that, I'll stop sharing and I will introduce our Chief Operating Officer, Barry Vesser, who's going to talk a little bit about how Climate Safe California and COP28 go together. Barry?
Thank you so much, Geraldine. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And first, I want to express the regrets of our CEO, Ellie Cohen, who could not be here today due to a family emergency. And we're all sending our prayers for Ellie and her family. So maybe we can start this conversation out by saying, why is the Climate Center going to COP in Dubai anyway? Why is an organization that is focused on climate and clean energy policy to reduce climate pollution at speed and scale in California going halfway around the world? And the reason we do it is we feel like COP really provides a global platform so that we can get the story out of where California is succeeding to meet its climate goals. And just as importantly, have legislators and people in the administrations and the Climate Center staff learn what else others are doing and what might catalyze more action here in California. It is also just an excellent time to build relationship with legislators and people in the administration. And at this last COP in Dubai, the Climate Center organized 7 events. One was on managed transition, which I'll talk a lot more about. One was about appropriate uses of green hydrogen, which Senator Stern was good enough to speak at. We also had one which was kind of on California's accomplishments, and several events on natural climate solutions, which I'll talk about in a minute, and some press conferences. I also want to mention that people in the legislature, members in the legislature, cannot get to COP on their own. They have to work through a nonprofit or other organization that is an official observer of the proceedings at COP. And so we and our partners, which include the Climate Registry and Environment California and California Environmental Voters, work together with the Speaker's office and with Senator Stern's office to really make sure that we can get as many legislators who want to go to COP as possible, and then try to make sure that they have a productive experience there. I'm going to run through a few slides just to give you a flavor of Dubai, a little flavor, and a little bit of COP as well. So let me go to my slides. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. So that's the Expo City. That's where the COP was held. That's right at the entrance. And that is my colleague, Mark Victoria, who's our senior statewide organizer, Bonnie Bennywall, who is our natural sequestrations manager, and myself. COP is an incredibly modern, clean city. Most of the buildings that you are looking at have been built in the last 20 years. About 25 years ago, there was almost nothing there. It's in the desert on the ocean. It is a place that has remarkable buildings, but also an extravagant relationship to energy consumption and water. And most of the water comes from desalination, which for those of you who aren't familiar with that process, it requires lots of energy. And where does that energy come from? Well, this is the view literally out of our hotel window. And what you're looking on is the largest natural gas plant in the world. Just to give you a sense of scale, this plant is 4 times larger than Diablo Canyon, the largest electricity producing facility in California. And you'll notice right there in the foreground, to the right bottom corner of your screen is a big billboard, and that is actually a billboard for an EV. It was one of the largest billboards I've ever seen as well. And it just sort of, for me, captures some of the contradictions you feel in Dubai at COP. Last thing I'll say is the air quality in Dubai is horrible. You know, you can see that having a country that is basically running on fossil fuels and built on fossil fuels has consequences. This is Expo City. The COP itself was kind of a magnificent place. It's huge, feels like a couple of college campuses put together, and there were a lot of people there. 80,000 people were estimated to be at COP this time. Here's some more of the buildings at COP that were kind of interesting. Of course, why we were there, as I said, was for the California delegation. This is an event on the left of the screen. Wade Crowfoot and this Speaker Rivas were there, and a number of assembly members joined that as well. And we were there to do events, and this event is our Managed Transition Away from Fossil Fuels panel. And you'll see a couple of our speakers today are there, Colin Rees and also Senator Monique Limon. And on the far part of your screen is Leon Randolph, the chair from CARB. This is another panel we did. You'll see Senator Stern there near the center of the screen, and next to Speaker Rivas, Assemblymember Jim Wood, and Senator Durazo. And this one was basically about what California is getting right, and you know, what else could we do? And here's one that was on natural climate solutions that was put together by Bonnie Bennywall, our staffer, and Secretary Ross from the California Department of Food and Agriculture presented at this, along with a couple of the international presenters. So that, I'm going to stop my share there. It just gives you a sense of who was there, who was at COP. And there are definitely some common themes of COP and California for me. And the first one, I have to say, is not the greatest, but is that the influence of big oil is happening in both places, pervasive, you might say. At COP, there were more than 2,500 registered oil and gas lobbyists, and that doesn't begin to count the petrostates that are represented at COP, who had plenty of representatives there as well. This COP, COP28, was probably one of the most important COPs since the 2015 agreement in Paris, because they did a stock take. And what a stock take means, it's kind of like a report card on progress to get to Paris goals. After this year we just went in with record-breaking extreme heat and other climate extremes. So I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But what I'd like to do is just offer you, before we get to our speakers, a couple of themes and other things that came out of COP that I think are relevant to the situation in California. So one of the most quoted things, and perhaps most important things that came out of COP, was that in the final agreement, there was language that committed to transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, so to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. So that's a great aspiration. You might be asking yourself, why did it take the United Nations and the COP process to get 30 years to have that in a document? The other thing I'll just say about that is there are no commitments from countries about how we get there or what their approach will be to get to that lofty goal. Today, we're going to talk on this webinar, we're going to talk a bit about the managed transition away from fossil fuels with Senator Limon and with Colin Rees. And let's say that this is, they were on a panel together in COP, as I said, and this is a very difficult thing to do. And we think that California has some way to go to really have a plan to do this. And we need to focus on where we need to be and how we will get there. Bottom line for me right now is the world continues to produce more oil. And our first speaker, Colin, will tell you who's leading the pack in that ignominious race. Another big theme at COP was loss and damage. So loss and damage is about developed countries like the United States and Europe paying developing countries, mostly in Asia, Africa, and South America, for damage created by the emissions that those developed countries committed. They disproportionately emitted those, historic emissions, and the developing countries are disproportionately being hit by the consequences and impacts of that. So this is a great thing that this has come about. And at this COP, they actually set up the fund and began to put money into the fund. So there's $750 million contributed to this fund. And I just want you to think about that for a second. $750 million basically for the global developing countries. Versus about $1.2 billion a day that the oil industry profits. And those are the profits they have in one day. Or maybe a more apt comparison is to tell you that from those horrible floods we had in Pakistan in 2022, there was $30 billion of damage created. So clearly a fund that doesn't add up yet to $1 billion is really wholly inadequate. And looking at California in this regard, and this year, where California has a projected $38 billion to $68 billion budget deficit, depending on who you talk to, and the governor's proposing billions of dollars in cuts and deferrals to climate priorities, some of which will disproportionately impact frontline communities. I hope that our speakers may want to comment on how do we maintain climate investments and commitments to low-income communities, even in the face of the budget's boom and bust. I see Geraldine's there, so I'm going to try and go through the rest of this quite quickly. So the global stocktake that I mentioned earlier did say that current actions that we're taking are insufficient for maintaining a 1.5C pathway to 2030. And in their text, they urge nations to triple renewable energy capacity and double the global average annual rate of energy efficiency and for a just transition away from fossil fuels. The final agreement did commit to a tripling of renewable energy capacity at COP, but we must also remember that COP commitments are voluntary. And you may have noticed that voluntary commitments sometimes don't happen. How do we hold each other accountable when we have something to do that is extremely hard? Senator Stern has done some thinking on that and in fact ran a successful piece of legislation last year on corporate accountability, which I hope he will share a little bit about with us today. I'm sure he is also will have some thoughts on how we can actually reach targets that we set as states and nations. Last thing I want to say is natural solutions did have a prominent place at the table at COP, and we are becoming, and they are becoming an increasingly important part of California's response to climate change. We were pleased to see the critical role of nature and agriculture were elevated in COP this year, which yielded tangible results such as food security and food being in the official negotiated text for the first time ever. And also there was a declaration on sustainable agriculture signed by almost 160 countries. We're not going to have time in the webinar today to talk about how important nature-based solutions are for getting us to where we need to go. But we will be running some policy this year in this sector to help us implement this at speed and scale, and we'll be having webinars in the future, so I hope you'll join us for those. So I don't want you to come away thinking that my critique of the outcomes of COP should be taken as a suggestion that it's a waste of time. We need COP, we need the process, and some good things do come out of it. But it alone will never get us to where we need to go. A consensus process among 199 countries is not a functional approach for solving the toughest problem humanity has ever confronted. National and subnational governments, and just so you know, in COP lingo, California is a subnational government, have to step up and show others what can be done. This is why California, the 5th largest economy in the world, and at ground zero for many climate impacts, needs to lead and do even more, both because we can, because our example matters, and because as California goes, so goes the world. So I'll end there and shift over to introducing my colleague, Colin Rees. Colin is the United States Program Manager at Oil Change International, where he works to end public support for oil, gas, and coal, and wind down fossil fuel production with a just and equitable transition. He has also worked at 350.org and in President Barack Obama's White House Council on Environmental Quality. Colin was at COP28 and spoke on our managed transition panel, as I said previously, and he was so good that we wanted to hear from him again and wanted you to hear from him. So please take it away, Colin. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Barry. That is overly kind, but I appreciate it and very happy to be joining all of you today for this critical discussion. Is this good? Okay, great. So as mentioned, I'm going to give a little global context on the fossil fuel situation, and then in particular, the role that the United States and California have to play in moving us toward the equitable fossil phase out that we know we need, and that movements around the world, including from California, were calling for aggressively in the lead up to COP28 in Dubai, in the March to End Fossil Fuels, for instance, in the California March in Sacramento, as well as actions throughout the year and far beyond, building up towards COP28, and then, of course, continuing past. I want to give a little context here about just how far in the lead the U.S. is in terms of oil and gas production and oil and gas expansion in particular. The big picture here is that we're going the wrong way on oil and gas supply in the global north. Even as we are starting to bend the curve on domestic emissions, we're starting to do a better job of using fewer fossil fuels and putting less carbon into the air. That is true in the United States as a whole. It's true in California as well. But that is only one piece of the puzzle. We talk about it in terms of a pair of scissors. One blade of the scissors is the supply of fossil fuels, and one is the demand for fossil fuels. So if we're pushing down on the demand for fossil fuels, that's great, but the scissors don't work without both blades. You actually need to be reducing the supply as well. And so that current incongruity is sort of one of the critical pieces I want to talk about here today. So to this graph, this is a graph of the top countries by increase in oil and gas production over the next 6 years, 7 years now. This was done a couple of years ago, but you can see the US is dwarfing the rest of the world in terms of how much we're planning to expand our production of oil and gas. I mentioned it's a couple years old. This is largely held true to form. The US is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas and the world's largest exporter of gas, often through LNG. And again, as this shows, by far the largest projected expander if we don't change course. The good thing about these projections is we can change course. We have an opportunity to advocate, to legislate, to make different decisions, and to make this not the reality that we're going to get to. Some of the other top countries in this category, you can see the top expanders, but some of the others who are saying good things about phasing out fossil fuels, even advocating for that fossil phase out in the context of COP28, but not doing the same thing at home. And I think that hypocrisy is really key, as I'll get into a little bit, include Canada, the United Kingdom, Norway, and Australia. I'll move on here in slides. This essentially encapsulates the core problem that we're facing on fossil fuel supply. We are talking about the need to phase out fossil fuels. For the first time, the UNFCCC COP decision text included that reference to transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's not where it needs to be, but it's a lot better than we've ever had before. And yet that's not what we're seeing on the ground. This is a graph of the red lines are really important to understand, because the red line, the bottom one, is the remaining carbon budget to stay under 1.5 degrees, to have a decent chance at that. The middle one is 1.7. The top line is to stay under 2 degrees. Those are sort of some common numbers that are thrown out as limits that we need to keep global warming under. I want to emphasize those are not targets. We should not be shooting for 2 degrees if we could possibly do less. We are seeing day in, day out with the mounting climate impacts in the US and far beyond that any amount of increased temperature rise has catastrophic impacts for humanity, for people's homes, for people's livelihoods, for people's jobs, and for our natural environment, of course. So none of this is to say we should definitely get up to that red line, but things get worse after those lines, and we know that. The bar graphs at the bottom, you see if we burnt all coal in just existing coal mines. So the key part to understand about this graph is this is the fossil fuels and the carbon contained in them in just already developed fossil fuel projects. So already developed coal mines and already drilled oil and gas fields. If we extracted and burnt all those fossil fuels, it would be the bar on the right. That would take us far past even 2 degrees. As you can see, over double the height of the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. What this means is even if we stopped burning and extracting any coal tomorrow, oil and gas alone would take us past the 1.5 degree limit if we don't do something to keep some of those fossil fuels in the ground. And so there's two pieces here. This is actually existing fossil fuel projects. As I mentioned, there is already steel in the ground. There's already oil and gas being drilled out of these fields and wells. And so all of this has nothing to do really with the previous graph or with this idea of fossil fuel expansion. Every new fossil fuel project that's approved, every new coal mine, every new oil and gas field is actually making these bar graphs even higher, is adding to the amount of fossil fuels that we know we will need to shut down if we're going to be able to reach our climate targets. So that's kind of the global context that we're coming up here. That's the mismatch between fossil fuel supply and demand, in addition to kind of what we're actually claiming to want on fossil fuels. And that's also, as we'll get into, that's the key problem with managing the transition here. The biggest thing that I would emphasize that needs to happen coming out of COP28 is for people to make a plan and stick to it. Make a plan, make a plan, make a plan. Political realities get in the way of that, of course. But as we are heading into this transition, we know that we can't leave the oil industry in charge of its own demise. They have shown absolutely no willingness to do so over the last many decades, and in fact, quite the opposite. We have seen what a chaotic, unmanaged decline of fossil fuels looks like, at least in the short term. Early COVID was a really good example of that. Early in the pandemic, oil prices crashed, production was limited for a while, demand was decreased. What happened was tens of thousands of oil workers lost their jobs with no benefits or recourse. Companies went bankrupt. Theoretically, it doesn't sound terrible. Obviously, it's terrible for the workers, but it didn't even stop the production. Those wells were immediately continued producing, sold off to somebody else. Most of those companies came through bankruptcy and continued producing on the other side, usually with big fat checks for the CEOs. Like, it didn't actually change business as usual because our systems are not set up to make that shift. All of that is why we need a managed transition, as the title of the webinar implies, rather than what we're seeing now, which is either no transition at all or an extremely unmanaged transition. Left alone, the fossil fuel industry will both continue to dig as much as possible and also has no plan to make workers or communities whole, to clean up its own mess, or to phase itself out of existence. So all of that is why making a plan is really important. But the problem is, if governments are not willing to acknowledge the reality of where we're actually at with supply right now, making a plan becomes really hard. And so this is sort of where we're at the global level. The other thing is it makes it really difficult for global South countries and those on the receiving end if they are sort of being force-fed fossil fuels through fossil fuel exports. A lot of this oil and gas in the US in particular is going towards exports and being shipped around the world, locking people into fossil fuel dependency. I want to bring it home a little bit more and emphasize that while there are some very good parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, some of you might know that is sort of President Biden's signature climate law that was passed about a year and a half ago now. It has some very good parts. It does a lot to incentivize clean energy technology, and we're already seeing the impacts in really good ways. It has some important investments as well. But one thing that it crucially doesn't do is address the fossil fuel problem. This is from a recent report that we put out just before the COP as Oil Change International, looking at new data projecting future energy demand and supply in the United States under the IRA. So because the IRA passed, it then took quite a while for people to figure out sort of exactly what would happen, how long it would take, the impacts of the IRA would be. We now do have some of that data started, and we're starting to see what that looks like. And what it looks like is not sufficient, especially for a country that claims they want to phase out fossil fuels. So we have gas and oil demand starting to decrease. That's great. It's not fast enough, but it's at least a start. And it shows that those parts of the law were well-intentioned and sort of acting as planned. What it also shows is an increase in both gas and oil production and soaring fossil fuel exports. Those are all terrible, terrible signs for getting us where we need to go on fossil fuels, and sort of directly in contradiction with what the US nominally committed to at COP28, the Biden administration's stated intent of phasing out fossil fuels, its actual actions under the IRA and other actions taken by the Biden administration are taking us in exactly the wrong direction. Last piece I want to touch here on, because this was two more bits. This is one that was really quite an issue at COP and will continue to be an issue in the international space if it's not addressed, is the issue of equity. We know that many countries and jurisdictions, such as California, have the capacity to fund a fair and fast transition, and are not necessarily that economically dependent on oil and gas revenue. So this is from a report that we released last year as well. We'll send it along as a follow-up. But essentially shows that top left category of the US, Norway, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada. These are relatively rich countries, among the richest in the world. They are also relatively not dependent on fossil fuels. They don't have a large degree of economic dependence on fossil fuels. That's not the only way to measure dependence, but it's a pretty good metric. And so what that means is these are countries who both have a lot of money to help make this transition happen and to take care of workers and communities in the transition. And also taking away fossil fuels is not a massive part of our economy. That's extra true in California. It's significantly lower than the US as a whole, even. And
Colin,
so this,
I'm gonna ask you to wrap it up in like 30 seconds if you can.
Yep, heading that way. So that equity piece here, I think, is one of the most important things to understand. And it's one of the reasons that there has been not enough action on fossil phase out globally. Is poor countries, global South countries, are looking at these rich producers who are doing very little on fossil fuels, and in fact, not nearly what they need to be. And they're saying, great, well, that means we don't need to act. It also means we will not get any money to act. So I want to close by talking about the key next steps in California and beyond. We need an immediate end to new fossil fuel expansion. This is not turning off the taps or the extraction tomorrow, but it is saying we can't afford to add more fuel to the fire. We can't make this problem and this hole that we're in even deeper. We need to speed up our phase-out timeline in line with equity. California, currently, I believe Governor Newsom is committed to a 2045 timeline for phasing out extraction. That needs to be significantly faster, and we know we can do that. This one is really, really critical, and I know there's whole follow-up webinars to go here, but avoiding the route of dangerous climate scams like carbon capture and storage, dirty hydrogen, all of these sorts of things, which can have very niche, important uses, but are not an excuse to continue business as usual. And we cannot let the oil industry push that sort of as a solution. And then, of course, fully funding the transition in an equitable fashion. That's at the US level and the global level. That's a little different than in California, but there's so much that we can do in California. And as Barry mentioned, we need to do that in a time of fluctuating budgets. My one recommendation there would be to end the billions of dollars in fossil fuel subsidies that we're currently giving to the industry in California and repurpose that money for a just transition. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that excellent presentation and really framing what we're up against and also why we need a managed transition. And I am going to turn to Senator Monique Limon now, who is going to talk a little bit about the California context and maybe take up some of the suggestions Colin made and talk about what it's like to work to try and get sensible legislation in the oil and gas sector in California. Senator Limon is the lead co-author for the historic oil and gas setbacks bill, SB 1137. She represents the 19th district that includes all of Santa Barbara County and over half of Ventura County. She is a climate champion. We are very pleased to have her with us at COP and happy to get in an entrance badge so she can get into COP. And her participation in the managed transition panel is wonderful. So welcome, Senator Limon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for allowing me the opportunity just to share some thoughts. I will tell you that this is my 8th year in the California State Legislature, and I've certainly worked on a number of climate bills, issues, policies, a lot on oil issues. Just in my first 7 years in the legislature, I ran 7 specific bills really targeting the impact that oil has left in our communities. And this is my very first COP that I attended. So I think I attended with a lot of excitement, about the opportunity to be a part and a piece of some of the conversations. As was said by Barry and others, really California didn't have the opportunity to be part of the global conversations, but as a subnational, there was definitely elements where we learned because we lead. As a state, we lead like a nation. And so there were these opportunities to really think about the work that we're doing in all these areas. In particular, I think that one of my takeaways is the fact that as a member who participated, there were a lot of people there who know our laws and who know our bills and had very specific points of engagement around that. And I think that says and speaks to really the role that California speaks. If you are at a global space and people can say, well, what about this law? What about that law in California? It means that what we're doing has an impact. I also just want to recognize that while generally, I think many of us that are here don't feel like we may have seen everything that we wanted to see, that perhaps the COP28 agreements were not as we may have liked. Everything starts somewhere. And I think back to, just for example, when the Paris Agreement happened, right? It needed to all have a starting point. And sometimes for those of us who work on legislation and think about the laws and the regulatory space as well, a starting point, even if an agreement without the meat and body of how it gets done, is better than no point at all. It allows us to refer, it allows us to create and shape and design in a way that's aligned with the goal itself. And I think for me that's an important takeaway, that while we may feel that it is a goal that is maybe perhaps somewhat empty in the details, nonetheless, it is a goal, and it is something that now, as a collective community of enviro, supporters and those that are thinking long and hard about what it's going to be, we can start to fill in what that looks like and align it to those goals. Certainly, we know that that there's what happened just at COP as it relates to being the first discussion in a more meaningful way, to take action on global stock take, I think is really important. And that is part of the global agreement. We know that we are falling behind, whether it is at the local level, state level, national level, global level. There are an estimated emission gap of 20 to 23.9 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And we would need to reduce our emissions by over 20 billion tons to meet the 1.5 Celsius goal in Paris. And so for the Paris Agreement. And I think that this really is important, and it is still part of the issues that are at hand. And it helps us think about what our ability is to adapt and what adaptation looks like for all communities. And so whether that's fragmented, incremental, or if it's sector specific. And these are part of the realities that we face. We don't accept that with excitement. We accept it as a reality and understanding that we have to address that reality because that is very, very important for us. COP ended with an agreement to begin the end of fossil fuels. And I think that California has witnessed and has transitioned and, into not transitioned out of, but into a conversation about the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. But nonetheless, part of that is, again, setting the goal and the ideas of where we want to go. But it has been very difficult in California. And certainly we know, and I think, we just heard that, from Colin, it's in particular about how hard it is. We set these goals and then we look at permitting, we look at regulation, and we realize that there's at times these goals that don't align with the practice. And I think that without that action, we continue to be behind, but California wants to be a leader in this space. I think moving away from fossil fuels will definitely take policy changes in many areas, including energy efficiency, building a cleaner energy portfolio, as well as investments in technology and community behavior and education. I will say that changing human behavior is among the most challenging things. And so having our communities really think about what we all need to do, not just what a law or a regulation is going to do, but our role as individuals in this is among the hardest things we have to do. And we have learned that even when we pass a law, that law is, changing the behavior of folks is definitely a piece that is significantly hard. And so whether it's driving, whether it's plastics, I mean, you name it, this is all part of the challenges that we deal with. But we are still committed, I think, as a state, as leaders in our state. Certainly you're going to hear from one of our environmental leaders in the state of California, Henry Stern, about this and what it's going to take for us to do this work. We don't give up. We consider our role at this particular thing. But I also feel one of the pieces that's really important is that California, and this is why I believe it was really critical to have so many stakeholders present at COP, despite some of our disillusion where we may have ended at the end of COP. I think that it's really important to be at the table, to be part of a discussion. And while we may not be at the table with the negotiations for the global world, we're at the table thinking about new energy sources. We're at the table thinking about the transition and our systems of energy. We're at the table thinking about the impacts of health and climate. We're at the table thinking about the communities that are impacted. We're at the table thinking about the jobs and what that means for our communities and how we ensure that our labor community who has been working in some of the energy spaces related to fossil fuel aren't folks that are left behind, that the green movement incorporates them. And all of those pieces make the whole. So I hope that our walk away, that moving as we move forward, we understand that while California is very aware that we do not represent the globe and all, we are a very critical part of that whole. And so we will continue to think about that. We'll continue to think about what we do here in the state and how we match what alignment could potentially happen across the globe, but also how we have real lived examples of what's worked and what hasn't worked. And these are things that I think a lot of communities across the globe have really picked up on and continue to engage with us as a legislature, as a state, and certainly as stakeholders, as NGOs who are thinking about this and really driving the enthusiasm, momentum to get this done. We definitely have more work to do, as I've stated, and I want to also uplift that in the environmental justice space, we continue to also make sure that we are not leaving communities behind, that especially communities that have suffered repeated history of being left behind, of being in proximity to polluters and pollution in ways that are very detrimental. So I want to thank you all for, again, this opportunity. I'm someone who born and raised on the Central Coast in Santa Barbara, and this is actually our 55th year anniversary of the big oil spill that happened in 1969. We were a county, we were a region who really thrived off the production of fossil fuels at a certain time, and that has changed. And that 1969 oil spill started to change how people believe about what's happened in our communities. People started to see with their own eyes the impacts that fossil fuels has had on our communities. And that, I think, has changed not just a county or a city or those who live on the coast, but those who were impacted in a great way, and now a region who really thinks about the role that fossil fuels has. So thank you again, and I appreciate the invitation to be at COP, but also the opportunity to continue to engage with all of you.
Thank you so much, Senator Limon, and we are so grateful for your work over the years on climate. We're going to take some questions for both you and for Colin. And the first question I have is one that Colin also raised, which is what, in your view, would be the best levers in 2024 California legislative session to end fossil fuel subsidies in California?
Well, I'll go ahead. I think that we have to continue to be at the table. There has been discussion over the last 3 years, really in looking at what the subsidies look like. And so I think as the reports, as the conversations have increased, I think that there is absolutely a desire from a body of individuals in the legislature that are interested in trying to move that forward. There have been interest and I think attempts to look at what that would potentially look like. The biggest challenge in 2024 on all fronts, including this front, but as it relates to the environment, is the budget that California is facing. And so there is going to be a lot of weariness from, I think, the collective in California who are really thinking, well, how do we get past this year? And certainly I think that there's a case to say, well, don't subsidize X or Y. And that will be a way that we can do it. So I think that California and the legislature will put a lot of things on the table, but what we will do, we will have to do, as a body, and we will have to figure out when the right time is to do that. In my perspective, the right time was yesterday to be able to do that. But, we are a collective, we are a body, and we have to really look at what that means. We also know that even in the legislature, I think it's, we have to work with the 3 parties, which is the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor's office, to figure out when we are able to do that. It is important to be able to have a timeline and a process for us to get there. And my hope is that we will eventually have that timeline and process, but all 3, I think, parties need to be at the table. And again, there are a group of us that are ready and eager.
Excellent. Thank you. And just a quick follow-up on that, because you mentioned the budget, which obviously is just enormous this year, the deficit that California is looking at and facing. In the light of the budget realities, what do you think? I mean, you are like a seasoned legislator particularly in this area, what do you think are the next steps that we can move in a managed transition away from fossil fuels? Like, what is the next place to work either with the oil industry or with partners to move that conversation forward?
Right. Well, I will say that there's immediate next steps and there's long-term next steps. I think the two most immediate next steps are really to protect the laws that we have passed. So Senate Bill 1137 is a perfect example. That is on the ballot. We are going to have to protect it. Because if we're not able to protect our existing laws that we have passed and that have passed with, a lot of hard work, with decades of trying to get to this particular law, right? Like, I'm a joint author on Senate Bill 1137. It was led by Senator Lena Gonzalez from Long Beach, but I had been an author in previous years to setbacks. It's not a new concept, right? It's many legislators have tried. If we can't protect our current laws, to talk about new laws doesn't seem like the right approach from my perspective of someone who's been here 8 years. I think we must protect what we have. I think when it comes to the budget in California, again, we have to protect the progress that we have. So what progress have we made? What kinds of investments have we made to help that transition? Some of you may have seen that some of those are on the chopping block for 2024 by either being paused or delayed. And so what does that look like? I think that the short-term strategy is about protecting our progress, legislatively, policy, laws, ballot, budget. And I think in the long term, it's, really prioritizing what the initiative, what the energy is for getting some of this work done on a year-by-year basis. I'm going to speak candidly of one of the challenges that happens is that at times we put 10 priorities that are compelling and competing at the exact same time. And sometimes that's the process that allows for all of them to fall, versus if we as a community of those who are concerned and care about climate change, about our environment, about the people that are harmed and impacted and, by all of this, said this is the number one thing, the number two thing that we would do, it's a little bit easier. But I think really in the short run for 2024, we're really going to have to protect our progress.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I just want to say for our audience sake that what Senator Limon is referring to there is a faux referendum put up by the oil and gas industry to try and roll back common sense public safety and health setbacks from oil and gas production and refinery facilities that Senator Limon and Senator Gonzalez helped push through the legislature. So it just shows you how difficult it is to make progress. But that's something I want to flag for all of you on the audience, because that is something you should be voting against this year and helping others understand. Colin, I'm going to turn to you for a second. I want to know, both from your experience at COP and also your perspective looking at the whole of the United States, where does California stack up on this issue of the managed transition, and how important do you think California's role is?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It's a great question. And I think the answer is that there are multiple truths we need to hold at once. California is nowhere near where it needs to be and has a lot of sort of pending issues still that I'll talk about for a sec. And also, it's doing all right relative to other places. And so I think what I see when I look at California is a choice point ahead, a fork in the road, an opportunity for true, bold leadership that does that managed transition well, that takes care of communities most impacted by the climate crisis, that avoids those false solutions, that doesn't go down that path, and that is willing to continue recent trends of kind of boldly confronting the fossil fuel industry. We saw that with Attorney General Bonta's lawsuit and some of Governor Newsom's rhetoric, of course. There's a bad version of this where California continues to kind of puddle along, do some important work on the demand side, not actively confront the fossil fuel industry, and not serve as that kind of bold leadership that we need. I think when I look internationally, what is needed is absolutely action on fossil fuels, but I think what we need is really bold political leadership to make that happen. There is a lack of examples out there of how this can truly be done well. We have Spain phasing out coal and kind of really taking care of its workers there. There's a single digit list of examples because we're just pretty early in this process. And what we desperately need is a kind of sizable jurisdiction taking action in the same way on oil and gas. And so I think California has the opportunity to do that, but it is not yet taking that opportunity at the statewide level. And that's, of course, no fault of Senator Limon. She's doing a spectacular job in the legislature, but this needs to be a commitment both at the executive level and at the legislative level. Speaking of those setbacks, we have seen a pretty deeply concerning rise in oil and gas extraction and new permits being granted even within those setback zones over the last year. There's some research I just dropped in. And so I think banning new permits for oil and gas would really send that political signal. It would allow California to join the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance as a full member, which is a global diplomatic coalition of jurisdictions who are leading this transition away from oil and gas. And so those are a couple ways I think that California can really step up as a political leader in this moment by ending new permits for oil and gas, taking on and continuing that cheerleading of the transition, and then very importantly, avoiding those false solutions here at home and investing in the transition.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. And I know this is probably our last questions for this Q&A segment. So what I'd like you guys to do is if each of you would respond to like, what do you think was your biggest takeaway from COP that's either relevant to California, Senator Limon for you, or Colin, was relevant for your work? Like, what do you think is, was your big takeaway?
So I will say for me, as a first-time COP attendee, I mean, my biggest takeaway was the significance that California plays. I was very, kind of taken back by the number of people who I had never met, but who followed some of the work, whether it's the work that I've led, as bills that I've had, or joint authored. I mean, people were very, very specific in a way that it demonstrated that people are following and watching and taking notes to what California is doing. And I would say in both directions. Some people were definitely not fans and some people were fans of. And so I think that is something that for me, I think, kind of redetermines in some ways that we really do need to have a California presence at this level. But it's like anything else. I think that because I'm a legislator who has been doing, some of this work for 8 years, and every single year I have been met with resistance and opposition from a lot of different sides, I walked into a space that was, a magnitude of a lot of things, but not different than what it's really like to get a law passed, with, some level of say this, do that. Let's agree to this, but not that. I mean, that is the world that we're in as legislators, and to really try. And that's why we're at it year after year after year, trying to kind of shape some of this policy. So I think for me, that would probably be my biggest takeaway.
Great. And Colin, if you can give us your takeaway in just about a minute, and then we will get to Senator Stern.
I'll keep it nice and short. Yeah, I mean, somewhat similar. I think as someone who has been to many COPs over the last several years, and advocated for fossil fuel and end to fossil fuels at all of them, I was blown away by how much that is the main conversation now. And what that meant was that for a lot of years, I think we didn't have to get into the details or didn't even have an opportunity to get into the nitty-gritty of what that means. We were just begging like literally anybody to discuss that. Now we've made huge progress thanks to everybody on this call and more. We are having that discussion, and it became even more clear to me just how important it is to be advocating for it to be done the right way, to be having these conversations about a managed transition, about ending fossil fuel subsidies, about avoiding false solutions, about the equity and finance to actually make this happen. Those are the sticking points, and those are the pieces in particular. If some amount of this is already going to be happening, those are the pieces that climate advocates should be laser focused on because they won't happen without us. So that was my takeaway at the global level. I think we're in a similar place in California. We've seen really, really important action on, of course, demand, but even on supply in terms of setbacks and other legislation and executive action. We've seen tentative moves toward like suggesting some subsidies be ended. I think getting that rubber onto the road, finishing that job essentially, and doing it in a way that protects workers and communities and sets us up well for the future is the key task both in California and beyond.
Great, thank you. And thank you both. As we all know, we need to do much more, but thank you both for helping us get to this point. It's been a slog and a fight, I know, and we're really grateful for the people who have been doing it for years. So thank you both. I just want to say one quick thing. There was a question about some of the analysis that Colin gave on countries like Norway and the US and oil production. I just want to recommend to you that if you go to Oil Change International, their website, you will see they have a paper on this, so you can look at their sources and their analysis for yourself. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn to an introduction of Senator Henry Stern, who represents the 27th Senate District, which includes parts of Los Angeles and Ventura counties. He has authored multiple cutting-edge climate and clean energy bills, including last year, SB 261 on corporate climate risk and accountability that was signed into law this past fall. He is a climate champion. He is also a COP veteran. We are very glad to have Senator Stern with us today. Senator Stern, I turn it over to you, and feel free to respond to some of the themes I did or anything else you think is relevant, but I think particularly, the budget in California, corporate accountability and other accountability, how we're going to get to our goals, all of those things I think people would love to hear your point of view on.
Cool. Thanks, Barry. Good to be back with you all. I really enjoyed listening to the last panel, I got to say. Between that sort of global view that Colin brings and then Senator Limon, you all should understand, if this is your first time hearing her or listening or meeting her, this is somebody who has looked the belly of the beast like right in the face, and gone through it and done some of the bravest work that anyone has done in California climate or environmental history. And she comes from a region, as do I. We both come from lands of giants where, Fran Pavley and Lois Capps and Hannah Beth Jackson and Sheila Kuehl and Henry Waxman. And there's all these sort of legends, but what she's done with this sort of workaday attitude that she talked about, doing oil legislation on bonding requirements and on, pipeline safety standards and, getting into the weeds of it all, and then doing something as monumental as SB 1137, that's now going to the ballot, is no small feat. So it was very good to be with her, and it actually made me feel better being in Dubai, because I didn't want to go on a PR tour. And the stakes are very high. And I'll just say on the COP front, I loved the rundown, but just to give you a sense, like when it got to that moment, when Putin showed up at the COP, you knew that the stakes were kind of higher than even just we usually think about, right? This is global geopolitics, and this is what wars are being fought for right now. And to see the pressure campaign that Putin put on the Saudis and the UAE to not agree to a fossil fuel transition showed you the sort of merger of the politics of war and power colliding with the politics of climate, very, very straight on. And it's all about oil and gas. So when we're moving these needles, it's the stakes are very high and very consequential, and high risk. And what Senator Limon talked about being at the table, or like how we are implicitly at the table. I would even say part of it is nudging people like Special Envoy Kerry's seat closer to the official table. And the fact that he walks by us when we're sitting around talking and he's like, hey, California, like, leave me alone. You guys are everywhere. Our presence, we were the largest subnational delegation in the world. rightly so, because we're the third largest consumer of petroleum in the world. I want to talk about that one for a sec next. But, the presence was just palpable, and it's sort of there's this sort of unquantified piece too. So I guess it's like the guilt trip or the pressure of having folks like us being so bold out there and being in the presence of our diplomatic corps and at the federal level really forces the expectations to be high enough to overcome straight threats from petro dictators. I mean, real stuff and real consequences playing out now in the Straits of Hormuz and down in the Red Sea on oil tankers. I mean, very real stuff. So where do we fit in? I think I agree with Senator Lamone's assessment of like, okay, let's not get scattered. We got a few really important things to do. Protect our progress, number one. I think that's right. Daniel Weeks asked in the Q&A, just specific laws act. So you guys heard 1137. And there's these other ones that Senator Wiener and I spearheaded with Senator Lamone's sage guidance as our banking chair and knowing how to deal with the financial side of oil transition. So we passed SB 253 and 261, and the chamber is threatening litigation, pressuring through the GOP against the SEC and the Biden administration, threatening boycotts of financial institutions that invest in fossil fuel transition expressly. Exxon is part of a lawsuit now in the federal circuit to stop shareholders from even being able to offer fossil fuel or emissions reduction plans in their shareholder meetings. CalPERS is being subpoenaed by the House GOP under Jim Jordan, threatening them for collusion with Ceres and others, all of whom want to make a transition, in theory, to net zero. But that piece of it, those bills that we worked on in that space, would make companies in California disclose their emissions and their climate risks. 261 is the risk, 253 is the emission side. The chamber is threatening both litigation, rollbacks, and pressuring the governor right now to, quote unquote, clean up the legislation, but in fact trying to slow down the implementation and delay it. It's currently not funded in the budget, so that's one of our primary concerns, is actually not a size of money, because it's a couple $1 million program that's mostly industry funded once it's up and running, and it's basically budget neutral. But the fact that it's not in there is a signal that, there's sort of a need for more courage, I think, from this administration and moving ahead. So part of what we're doing right now is trying to make it very clear to the administration how important this is for the climate community. So I would keep, close eye and be as noisy as you can in our budget process, advocating for the implementation of 253 and 261. The reason I would say it's so important is because, you can do a lot of big talk out there about what you're doing with carbon neutrality. And when we're talking about, the largest multi-billion-dollar corporations in the world, there's a lot of announcements and there's a lot of targets and talk, but we want to see math and we want to see numbers, and we want an apples to apples understanding of what each company's footprint really looks like. This is an expansion of where the Air Board is currently doing their work, which is direct emitters just within California. And what I think makes this the most significant legislation in straight climate and greenhouse gas emissions since AB 32 is that now we're looking at a scope much beyond that. Those of you who don't know about sort of scope emissions and what that technically means, when you're talking scope 1 and 2, those are your direct emissions from your activities, and then the indirect emissions from the things you buy. But your supply chain and where things come from that you buy is actually a much larger part of most companies' footprint. So you think about Amazon, they run servers and they have data farms, but the network of goods movement behind Amazon is vast. And so if Amazon is able to say we're going green, but in fact is only just like serving more vegetarian lunches and running their data farms on cheap hydropower, that is in some sense going green, but 90% of their portfolio is being run, say, on gasoline and diesel, moving goods all over the world that's not being accounted for. We don't think that's an accurate version of going green. So we are trying to bring some rigor, some CARB level enforceable rigor to it, and not surprisingly, they're fighting us on it. So that's going to be a battle, and it's, I think, going to manifest itself through the budget, although there could be other venues too. Like I said, the courts may be looked at. But I guess I just wanted to, like, while I got 1 more minute left, or whoever has been brave enough to stick around to the end of this call, I want to pivot to this broader question though around fossil fuel transition. And Colin sort of got me thinking, and I was there when Frac Tracker started, and you guys got to click that link of his. Make sure you click it and go zoom in on your neighborhood. You'll be surprised. Those of you who live in Los Angeles, you'll be very surprised, I bet. The Beverly Hillbillies was not just black and white, still today. We are an oil town. We are an oil state. We built ourselves off of oil and gold, but oil came before even agriculture really did. Chevron owned the water in the valley to sell it to the farmers. These assets run to the core and foundation of the state's economy. And I want to sort of see that, what is that dependency math that Colin had out there in terms of our state's dependency. I would posit that we're quite dependent. We are the largest, as I said, petroleum consumer in the entire world besides the US and China. That's on sort of gasoline and diesel. And then you add natural gas to that. We are the most gas intensive state economy in the West. And I think just at a net level dwarf every other economy in the United States for natural gas, which we are going to this year try to rename to be what it truly is, which is methane gas. You might say fossil gas, but there's nothing natural about it. And that tension around gas exports and gas intensity, I think gas is really where we got to put our collective heads as well as oil in this state. So in Senator Lamone's district, they're firing up a gas plant right in the middle of Oxnard, Port Hueneme, all these disadvantaged communities there that were promised it was going to close. And now it's getting refired. And those kinds of local decisions that this government in California is making right now, I think we're going to have to dig into details and try to figure out how to transition those assets. So take, for example, that power plant right in Senator Lamone's backyard. That could be converted to a 100 megawatt battery storage site in less than a year if we got the financing right and the incentive structures right. Take an oil field in the Central Valley that is currently responsible for, say, 40% of local tax base for, X, Y, or Z small town through that area. CRC's fields, for example. What if we looked at those assets and the value of not bringing them up and found ways to repurpose that land in a way that the transition plan is not just a sort of, hey, workers, if you're out of business, if you're out of work, here's like some unemployment insurance or a jobs guarantee for you, and thinking more about managing those assets and repurposing them such that you could say credit the carbon not removed from that ground and not severed. The subsidies that are currently going to extracting it, you could almost reverse that subsidy and say to sequester it without ever removing it from the earth. You could get credit for that. There are examples of this in groundwater policy happening right now in a land repurposing program that we've been sort of studying and thinking about. How do you take these massive assets and put them to different use in a way that doesn't require the general fund right now? So that's where we're going to be focusing, and even all the way downstream to a gas station. And as, say, your underground storage tank ages and you've got to make a decision about your gas station, is there going to be more value maybe in putting a high voltage DC charger in that station? So all those sort of tough spots that are very project oriented, very nitty gritty, but I think have some programmatic. So that's the effort I think we've got to put into the transition, what we achieved in Dubai. It's going to be asset by asset, sector by sector, and engaging with the fossil fuel industry directly, and not in a, a Pollyannish way, but in a very serious way, because they have an ability, as you just saw in Chevron's $5 billion write-down, to play with us. They can play with the refining assets. They are going to play hard, and they are going to make it hurt. And so how we wrestle with these beasts is going to define the political possibilities. Because as we saw Putin do to Germany, leveraging them on fossil fuels, they'll do the same to us without, say, a war, but an economic war. And I think that's what we're going to unfortunately see more of this year. And so we got to just be ready, and it's high stakes. It's the whole country. It's all of it on the line. So thanks for giving me a moment to riff, and I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Senator Stern. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple of quick questions for you.
Sure.
And we're going to go fast because we're getting near the end here. And first of all, I was going to ask you, how do we overcome the power of big oil in the legislature and with the California state government? And you reminded me, it's not just big oil, it's big gas as well. And I like to call it fossil gas, but I'll go with methane gas.
Yeah,
That's
check out our bill. It's coming. Sneak preview, but we're open to fossil. We're gonna try to just get it through. We'll see what happens.
Excellent. So you've got a bill coming in that.
Yes.
Excellent. So everybody, you heard it here first.
Sneak peek.
And we'll get a quick peek soon. And then on 261 and 253, one of our participants asked, how do we ensure that they are fully implemented as written? And I'm going to say to our comms team, please listen to this, because we should probably be building a take action on it. Take it away, Senator Stern.
We're going to have budget hearings coming up. I think testimony will be very helpful. I think either at the hearing itself, I think flooding those hearings and making it clear we want to see full implementation now would be very helpful. So that's in full budget in the Senate. I think it's next week. Maybe your folks can help. Sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head, but Assembly just had theirs. We had a pretty good showing there. It's actually pretty solid, but I would say showing up and then also just signing in and shoring up the other legislators to thank them and say, like, we know you worked hard to get these bills passed. And so with the budget chairs, Skinner and Gabriel, to let them know that this is really important. Still, you have the power to implement this and do this. We hold the purse strings. The governor can kind of, be a little more cautious, if you will, but we can make it really clear. And I think shoring up the legislature and making us hear it, and then we can be empowered then to go to the governor and say, hey, let's move forward. Like, we can do this. I think we're there. I'm an optimist about it. I don't want to presume any, I think we're just going to have to keep that pressure on.
Excellent. And maybe I'll just say to people, what Senator Stern is referring to is when they have budget committee hearings, it is really helpful to have a lot of people in the audience who are going to support some of the things we've talked about, 261, 253, not cutting climate priorities. So if you're interested in that, feel free to drop us, and we'll put our info at the Climate Center address in there. Feel free to drop us a note, and we'll make sure you get the next committee hearings on your radar.
Yeah, and come take a field trip, really, especially if you're in the Bay. It's fun. Well, we'll meet up with you. I mean, I always love a good Sacramento. So anyone here who is eager to come up, budget hearings are probably a good venue to quickly make your voice heard, and then, come see Senator Lamone, come see myself. Anyway, open invite.
Thank you so much. And Senator Stern, I'm going to close out by just one quick 1-minute question, which is, what was your takeaway from COP? If you had to pin it on one thing, what do you think the biggest thing
I have some hope that like, in the face of threats like what I'm talking, I mean, you were with me in the panel when my phone went off. It's like, oh, Putin's in the building. Or not in the building, I guess he couldn't get in the building. He'd be arrested technically right, they have a warrant for him. So they had the meeting outside the building, but Putin's here. And it just, we can defy those threats and that violence and all the sort of pressures and the naysaying, and here too to scare people that their commute and their costs and their families are going to be decimated by a transition, and not let that fear sort of overcome us. So if they did that at that really high level, and we were sort of able to get those actual words, fossil fuel transition, on a piece of paper, get it paper to practice. But I don't know, I somehow, maybe I'm just trying to self-justify with the Airbus 380 flights round trip that went there. I want to go like on green sail, like I want to sail out there next time. I don't know, we'll have to figure out a better commute strategy next COP. But yeah, that there's some hope, and that people have some courage, and that there's these interlocking alliances that the US is willing, like, that we are putting at the centerpiece of our diplomacy in the world, while we're, yes, becoming a gas exporter and trying to like stop Russia and overcome Iran with our oil and gas as the sort of replacement. But the theory is that if we then figure out the transition here, we can have enough control, along with Canada, Norway, the other sort of benevolent petro giants, to then turn off that spigot when it's time. And if the UAE and the Saudis come on board with that bigger plan, maybe there's a chance. Anyway, I'm just giving you a little bit of hope. I'm not trying to overdo the hope here.
Well, thank you for leading us with hope, Senator Stern. And I'm going to give people a chance to do something that I always think is hopeful, which is take action. And I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Geraldine Lopez Mendoza, and just thank you, Senator Stern, Senator Limon, Colin Rees, for your time today and for all you're doing for the sake of the climate and a climate-safe future.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Senator Stern. I want to echo Barry's thanks to our guests today, Senator Stern and Limon, and Colin Rees. Appreciate you taking the time to converse with. There were about 120 people or so at our most. In terms of taking action, in line with everything we heard today, what we're asking folks to do is to write to Governor Newsom via email to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and prioritize climate investments. At this time, when we are faced with a $38 billion deficit, it is the time to examine all the funds that go to fossil fuel interests and cut them off. They just don't need it. And we do. We as a community and as a state, we need climate solutions to be funded, not defunded or delayed. So I put in the chat the link to where you can send an email to Governor Newsom. You can also share it by various social media links, which is located at the top of the page. And you're welcome to take that action based on everything you heard today. Sometimes it's frustrating not to then have something that you can actually do that's solid. I want to thank everyone for attending and for hanging in. We had about 100 folks at the end, and there's a lot of work that goes into these webinars, and we welcome you, and we want to thank you for sticking with us and taking action. That's a good question, Erica. Erica's asking, where do we send their own emails? If we find that where you can directly email the governor's office, we'll send it around to all the registrants when we send around the slides that we used today, as well as the recording of the webinar. So with 3 minutes left, oh, Janet Cox just posted it. With 3 minutes left, I would like to conclude our webinar today. I want to thank you again for being here, for taking the time, for caring about the climate, and for taking action if you choose to do so. Again, a big thanks to our speakers, and we'll see you next time on February 22nd, which is our next webinar on funding for climate resiliency. And hang on a second, if somebody could drop that link into the chat, I'd be grateful. Because we'd like folks to be able to sign up and register if they can. Okay, so you can go to our website and register for our next webinar, which is coming up on February 22nd. Thank you everyone for being here. Happy Wednesday. You're in the middle of the week, you're almost there. And look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.